A very, very warm welcome. It's great to see so many of you here today. We had over 230 registered for this webinar, which is wonderful to see the interest in the subject, the topic, which of course is so important, and no doubt that is very much to do with our very distinguished speaker today. But before we start, many of you will have heard the very sad news about Professor Rosemary Hollis, Rosie to those who knew her, who has just passed away. She was an inspiration to us all involved in looking at the Middle East. And I know that she will be very sorely missed. She spoke with extraordinary clarity and honesty on numerous issues, not least on Israel-Palestine, what we're about to talk about today. Anyhow, without further ado, we are going to move on to the topic of today's talk, the 100 Years' War in Palestine. The title reminded me of a delegation that I was involved in. I took to Palestine some years back now, of Northern Irish trade unionists. And we were relaxing at dinner with Palestinian students and teachers, with their counterparts. And one of the Irish delegates piped up and asked the Palestinian students how long their conflict had gone on for. Oh, about 100 years. And inevitably, the question came back. And how long has the conflict in Ireland lasted? Well, came the answer, around about 700 years or so. And very quickly, all the Palestinians looked at each other rather glumly, as if to say, we've got another 600 years left. Well, let's hope not. Anyhow, this is a remarkable book by Professor Rashid Khalidi, a work of scholarship interwoven with elements of his own personal family narrative. And as you can see from his bio, you've all had circulated, he has a deeply impressive record, prodigious author, journalist, one of the most articulate Palestinian intellectuals around. He's the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. He's also the co-editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies, which I heartily recommend for those of you who are deeply interested in matters Palestinian. And he was the president of the Middle East Studies Association, and also he was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. I won't give you the long list of books that he's written before this one, but it's all of them are worthwhile getting hold of. We are going to have a conversation and then open it up as ever to Q&A. That will be in the chat. So please put your questions there, make them short and brief. We have a lot of people on the call today, so I will try to get them all in when we come round to the Q&A. So just to remind you everyone, if you could put your microphones on mute. Professor Rashid, thank you so much, first of all, for being with us today and for writing this book.
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks to everybody who is making time in their day. We're all locked down or semi-locked down. We are in the country with the largest number of fatalities from this awful pandemic. I believe you're in the country with the second largest number of fatalities.
We have that unwanted record, I'm afraid, yes.
Indeed. So thanks to everyone for being here.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you. And I suppose, you know, the title begs the first question in a sense of, you know, 100 years war, and it's now obviously gone on longer than that. How long do you think this conflict can continue? You dedicate this book to your grandchildren in the hope that they will see the end of this war. Looking at it now, do you see any possibility of that?
In spite of the grimness of the current situation in Palestine, I think there are a few reasons for guarded optimism. I think that as Israel makes clearer and clearer the nature of the Zionist project, and it's fully achieved through Israeli law and Israeli practices, the incompatibility of what they're doing and what they have been doing with liberal democracy and with ideas of justice and fairness is becoming more and more apparent. We see this in this country in the change on campuses, college campuses, university campuses, change in liberal Protestant denominations, the change at the base of the Democratic Party, which has shifted from a position of blind, unquestioning support of anything and everything Israel does to a very critical stance. That doesn't mean the party has shifted, because the party leadership is still by and large where it was, but the party base has shifted. And that's something unprecedented. You actually have a Democratic Party forcing its leadership to take positions that they never would have dreamed of taking in the past. And that's an ongoing process. As the United States changes to a country which is more diverse, that the majority party in the United States, which is the Democratic Party, sooner or later is going to have more and more influence. So I have many reasons for optimism. On the other hand, this war could go on for a very, very long time. I'm actually beginning a study comparing settler colonialism in Palestine and settler colonialism in Ireland. Funny that you should have mentioned that connection. And the 700 or 800 years are obviously very different to what we have in Palestine over 100 years. But there are some similarities. And so while I'm guardedly optimistic, I certainly recognize that the power that upholds the status quo, the power that Europe, for example, has, and which it has exercised essentially to maintain the status quo, starting with Britain's initial declaration of war on Palestine in 1917 in the form of the Balfour Declaration, and up to the present time, when the EU and Europe are Israel's largest trading partner. That power obviously helps to maintain the status quo, as does the enormous weight exerted by the United States. But in spite of that, I think there are reasons to hope that sooner or later, hopefully sooner, this conflict might be resolved in a just and an equitable fashion.
Indeed, one can hope for that. You've divided this book into 6 chapters, what you call 6 declarations of war on Palestine. The one that started with the Balfour Declaration, the Nakba 1947, 1967, 82, of course, with the invasion of Lebanon and the first Intifada, and then the second one from 2000 onwards until 2014. Perhaps you could explain your reasoning behind this, and indeed whether you'll be writing an updated version with a 7th declaration of war, given that we are facing the possibility, I guess, of a major Israeli annexation in the ensuing months.
Right. Well, in fact, in the final chapter, in talking about what I call the 6th declaration of war, I suggest that the Trump plan, which is Netanyahu's plan, which is the plan of the extreme Israeli right, is in fact the 6th declaration of war. So we are seeing the implementation over time of a declaration of war that I register as starting with the wars on Gaza and continuing through the Trump plan. The reason that I chose that metaphor, I suppose you can call it, of declarations of war on the Palestinians, and I describe what has happened in Palestine not as a tragic conflict between 2 national movements or as a struggle between 2 equal peoples, is that the struggle has always been completely unequal. The struggle has always been a colonial one, in which a colonial settler movement backed by the greatest imperial power of its age, Great Britain, and then the greatest imperial power of the post-war era, the United States, has systematically uprooted the Palestinian people from their homeland and replaced them with an entirely new entity, the Israeli people and the state of Israel. And I mark that by talking about what I call declarations of war. The Balfour Declaration is not a neutral document. The League of Nations mandate, which incorporates the Balfour Declaration, is not a neutral document. It is a declaration of war on the Palestinians. The people of the country in question are never mentioned. Their national rights, their political rights are not mentioned, are not allowed. Another people, the Jewish people, are described in detail, and in the mandate, article after article after article describes what the mandatory power is supposed to do for them. I describe this as a declaration of war. It's not a neutral international document. It is, in fact, a statement that the greatest power of the age intends to supplant the indigenous people with a new political entity. I describe the Partition Resolution of 1947 similarly. I describe Security Council Resolution 242 of November 1967 similarly. The ways in which these international declarations operated was meant to further the Zionist project and later on the creation and strengthening of the state of Israel in its ambitions to take over the entirety of historic Palestine, which it is now on the point of completing with this annexation plan. So I chose this approach partly to shake the completely false narratives, largely created either by imperial historians or by Zionist historians, which describe the conflict entirely differently. This has been a war on Palestine and on the Palestinian people, and it's not just been waged by the Zionist movement or Israel. In fact, at some stages, it was largely waged by others. Great Britain, during the 1936-39 revolt, brought in 1 soldier for every 3 adult male Palestinian Arabs, killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled 10% of the adult male population. That was a British war in service of the Zionist project on the Palestinian people. And the war came a long time after the declaration of war, the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate. Similarly, the declaration of war, 1947, the partition resolution, unfolded over several years in practice. And so I've used this metaphor to explain that this has not been some kind of tragic conflict, that it essentially is a colonial conflict, that it is essentially a conflict supported from the outside by great powers, and could not possibly have developed as it did without that external support.
Absolutely, and you mentioned what we have in common at the moment with the United States in terms of the pandemic, but there is also, in recent days, we've both been really looking at our history, some of the more unpleasant aspects of the history. You're probably aware that we had the issue at the weekend of the pulling down of a statue in Bristol of somebody who'd profited from the slave trade. I mean, to what extent do you think, how much has Britain got to come to terms with its own historical record in Palestine? We had the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration 3 years ago. I still think there's a lot that Britain needs to acknowledge. How do you see that process? I mean, what, you know, how bad was our role in all of this?
Quite awful. I think that what we require is something on the order of what the Queen did in going to Ireland. Britain obviously caused much more harm to Ireland than it did to Palestine. But I think that her gesture, which when I was in Ireland, even today, recently, a few months ago, is very well remembered and was very well received. On the symbolic plane is something on the order of what is required. More, however, is required. Britain played the decisive role. The Zionist movement was a nascent national movement in search of an external patron, a colonial project without a colonial metropole. Britain provided that metropole. Britain provided the troops. Britain provided what Zev Jabotinsky called the iron wall without which the Zionist project could not succeed. And it's for Britain to recognize that, to recognize the enormous iniquities inherent in the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate itself. And in some of the things that Britain did afterwards, but in particular in that period. I think that the present moment actually, where in this country, the United States is facing in a way it never has before, perhaps since the Civil War in the 19th century, its own structural racism, its own historical iniquities. Maybe a propitious moment for this kind of thing here, there, and in Europe. It's not just Britain, it's not just the United States who played important roles in bringing injustice and iniquity to Palestine.
It's always amazed me that actually so many Zionists, Israeli people who support the government of Israel who always sort of say that actually it's the other way around, that it was Britain who failed the Zionists, that they make this argument. It's an extraordinary way of trying to look at things. It's hard to see how that can be justified.
Well, there is a turning point. On the eve of World War II, Britain did shift its policy from complete, utter, unabashed support for the maximalist Zionist project to a more limited level of support. And it reneged on some of the commitments that the Zionists understood that they had received in the form of the white paper. Britain basically prepared itself for World War II by saying, we're going to fight World War II in the Arab world, in part. And it did, in North Africa, in Palestine, in Syria, and in Iraq. And we have an India in which our army includes a lot of Muslims who are very angry at the brutalities and atrocities that the British Army is committing against fellow Muslims in Palestine. And so Britain shifted. And even though it had provided 20 years of unstinting support, 22 years of unstinting support for Zionism, that shift enabled the Zionists to claim, oh, that Britain had betrayed them and that Britain had not done what it should have done. Well, it did much more than that in the 22 years in which the Zionist project was established and could only have been established with enormous British support.
Indeed, it certainly got that. I mean, reading your book, which is, terrific. I mean, pretty much in every chapter, there is a huge amount about the myths, the propaganda, the Hasbara that were basically propagated by Zionist leaders, thinkers, supporters. What, in your view, has been the most damaging, and the ones that perhaps still have the most traction, particularly, say, in the United States today?
Well, I think summed up in a slogan that Israel Zangwill and many others repeated: "Land without a people for a land without a people for a people without a land without a people for a people without a land." The idea that Palestine was an empty country, terra nullius, a place without a heritage and without an indigenous population that deserved recognition or self-determination. That is a very powerful idea. And it's linked to another idea, which is that the only legitimate owners of this land are the Jewish people. Because of the unquestionable Jewish connection to the land of Israel, that religious connection through Zionism, through modern nationalism, is transmuted into a land deed. And that has had enormous currency, especially in Protestant sectors of the United States and Great Britain. For many people, that was a convincing argument because of their religious faith, because of their understanding of the Bible, or misunderstanding of the Bible, as the case may be. And there are many others. But I think that the erasure of the Palestinians, which has been a constant in the efforts of the Zionist project and its backers, the idea that they are not legitimate, the legitimate indigenous population of this country with natural rights, is perhaps the crucial piece of Hasbara, the crucial piece of propaganda that has delegitimized the original population of the country and its rights, and allowed their replacement by an entirely new people, a different people.
I mean, one thing that we get confronted with a lot here, and I think in dealing with politicians and MPs, is the rejectionist myth. The one where it's always the Palestinians, it's always the Arab side, it has always rejected peace, it's always the Israeli side that has welcomed negotiations. You even get it now that somehow the Palestinians are to be blamed for rejecting the Trump plan, or what he called a suggestion at one point. I mean, how would you answer that charge, that the Palestinians were always the rejectionist party?
Well, I mean, it requires a great deal of ignorance to make that argument, or a great deal of self-deception. One only has to look at the plans being offered to see why the Palestinians were completely unable to accept them. The partition plan took a country which had, according to the UN Charter, the right of national self-determination with an overwhelming Palestinian majority, gave most of it to a minority. It was an inherently unjust plan. It violated the UN Charter, but the United States and the Soviet Union rammed it through the General Assembly in the form of General Assembly Resolution 181 in November 1947, and it was imposed. What was meant to impose was the creation of a Jewish state. The Arab state that was called for was never created, and the great powers didn't care one bit about it. They had no intention of creating an Arab state, in fact, and did not lift a finger when it was strangled in its cradle by an unholy combination of Britain, Transjordan, and of course Israel mainly. And one could go through so-called peace plan by peace plan and ask, why would anybody expect the Palestinians to accept them? Security Council resolution doesn't even mention the Palestinians. They weren't asked to accept it. Security Council resolution imposed a framework intended to eliminate Palestine, and designed to eliminate the Palestinians. So that the irony is that the Palestinians are forced to jump through a hoop which was intentionally closed to exclude them. To join in the peace process, you have to accept 242, but 242 doesn't mention Palestine or the Palestinians or make any reference to them. Just resolution of the refugee problem is the only nod towards them, and it's not even mentioned which refugee problem. And one could go plan by plan. One has to begin in another place to understand this. One has to begin by talking about Zionism as a colonial settler project. One has to talk about it as intended to replace the indigenous, legitimate population, which had national rights, according to the Covenant of the League of Nations, according to Britain's promises to the Arabs during World War I, and according to the UN Charter, with another people, a newly created entity, but what has now become a genuine national entity, let's say the State of Israel, and which has been allowed by the international community to take more and more and more of this country. So the plans that are offered never came anywhere near not only justice or the requirements of international law, but also the aspirations of the Palestinians, which were to live as a sovereign people in their own homeland. I could go through the Trump plan, or I could go through the things that were offered to us in the Washington and in the Madrid and Washington negotiations, or I could go through the Oslo Accords, which the Palestinians sadly did accept. So that's the great contradiction to this ludicrous line of argument that the Palestinians have always rejected everything offered to them. To their great sorrow, their leadership accepted a plan which was designed to prevent them from having self-determination, designed to perpetuate the colonization of their land, and designed to make permanent the military occupation of their territory. The Oslo Accords are being implemented by Netanyahu in a certain sense faithfully. This is always what was intended by Oslo. And in the book, I go back to the real brain behind this, which was Menachem Begin, back in Camp David in 1978, and laying down the idea of autonomy for the Palestinians, but no control over land, no control over sovereignty, no control over anything, actually. That in essence is the Oslo Accord. So the one plan that the Palestinians accepted turned out to be a poisoned chalice.
Absolutely, and you also in your book have quite a lot of comment on the role of Arab states, and you point out at one point that Arab public opinion remains highly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. You highlight an opinion poll in 2016 where 75% of respondents in 12 Arab countries considered the Palestine cause to be one of concern to all Arabs. Do you think Arab leaders, Arab governments are paying enough attention to that? Do you think that, in a similar vein, that the Israeli government is perhaps getting a little carried away with some of the warming in their relations with Arab states?
Well, I think that you touched on something that's really quite important. One of the great canards of the modern era is that the Arabs, quote unquote, are perfectly happy for a rapprochement with Israel and don't care about Palestine. Well, if you talk about the Arab peoples, that's demonstrably false. There are many other opinion polls that show the same thing that the one you cited shows. If you're talking about Arab governments, that's an entirely different issue. And one has to take a look at what these Arab governments are. They are some of them, the most absolute monarchies on earth. They're governments that make Louis XIV or King John look like enlightened Democrats. They are the most absolute monarchies on earth, the Gulf regimes. They include some of the worst dictatorships on earth. Since the fall of Gaddafi and the fall of Saddam Hussein, we have in Egypt and several other Arab countries military regimes that refuse under any circumstances to bow to the will of their peoples. That's true in Algeria, that's true in Sudan, where the military cling to power in spite of upheavals and uprisings against them. So you're talking about an entirely unrepresentative set of governments which are illegitimate in many cases in the eyes of their own peoples, and which are in many cases largely dependent on external support. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, I could go through the list, are intimately linked to Western powers. Algeria, the Algerian military regime, intimately linked to Western powers, without whose support they would be much weaker in the face of their own peoples. These governments are perfectly willing to do what the United States wants, which is to establish relations with Israel, or are perfectly happy because of their issues with, say, Iran, to align themselves directly with Israel. They don't represent the Arabs. They don't represent the Arab peoples. They represent their own, the kleptocracies that govern these countries, and nothing else, and that benefit Western corporations, arms dealers, oil companies, real estate firms in London, Paris, and New York, which profit in the billions from the theft of the resources of these countries by the thieves who rule them against the will of their own people. Of course, these people have no sympathy for Palestine, and they have no sympathy for any of the aspirations of their own peoples. So it's not surprising that they should have this attitude towards Palestine.
Your book contains some pretty blunt home truths to the Palestinian leadership as well, and how they've handled things through these 6 declarations of war. What do you think was the biggest mistake that the historic leadership has made in terms of Palestine? You know, and indeed what they should be doing now to handle what is obviously a pretty significant crisis of the moment.
Well, I lay out in the book a number of major, in my view, major mistakes made by different generations of Palestinian leadership, whether the old feudal leadership of the 20s and the 30s, the old notables who formed the Arab Higher Committee and other bodies, or whether the PLO, or whether the Palestinian Authority today. I go in great detail through some of their mistakes. Also some of their successes. Certainly the PLO achieved certain successes. For the first time in history, the Palestinians were enabled to address the world in their own right as a result of the PLO's campaigns, mainly diplomatic campaigns. As to what they should be and should not be doing now, it's perfectly clear. The Oslo framework was assiduously designed in order to prevent self-determination, enable colonial expansion of the colonial project, and maintain permanent Israeli military control over the Palestinians. There has to be a root and branch rejection of that entire approach, and a rethinking of Palestinian strategic objectives, a reunification and revival of the Palestinian national movement, a renewal of what was very successful in the 60s and 70s, an appeal to Arab public opinion over the heads of the dictators and absolute monarchs who rule many Arab countries, and a renewed appeal both to Israelis and to Europeans and Americans on the basis of a project for a just and sustainable solution, which the Palestinians are not putting forward anymore. I mean, there are different eras in which the Palestinians put forward projects that had some resonance internationally. That's not the case today. There is no Palestinian project, and there is no Palestinian voice internationally, except the voice of Palestinian civil society, boycott, divestment, sanctions, student movements, which actually, as I say in the book, have succeeded in doing much more than the Palestinian leadership over the past decade or two in terms of furthering the Palestine cause internationally.
And I can't let you go away before we go to questions. I mean, we're in an election year in the United States, so we in Britain obviously look at that with great interest. I mean, how do you see this shaping up between Biden and Trump in terms of what it would mean for this issue? You know, obviously we have a pretty good idea about Trump, what he's up to at the moment, but what another 4 years of Trump would mean for the Palestinian cause, or even Biden. You know, he's not exactly got a record that will warm the hearts of every Palestinian, but as you indicated earlier, the Democrat Party seems to be much more you know, sympathetic or going in that direction, at least at a grassroots level. I mean, how do you see things in the US?
Well, 4 more years of Trump would be a global catastrophe, not just for Palestine, for the climate, for racial relations in the United States and the world, for democracy in the United States and the world, for the United States' position in the world. There's no level on which it would not be the worst possible outcome. A Biden administration, leaving aside everything else, on Palestine promises to be as bad as previous Democratic administrations, Clinton, Carter, Obama, were perfectly supportive of a situation in which the Palestinians are systematically being dispossessed and systematically being boxed in more and more and more tightly. Carter, for all of the change in his position since he left office, is responsible for Camp David, which is where the original ideas that are being implemented today were produced by Begin and imposed on Sadat and Carter. I talk about this in the book. Each got advantages out of that deal, but the Palestinians suffered. President Clinton, when he came into office, reversed everything that Bush and Baker had done to try and move towards a more equitable solution, and helped to give us the catastrophic outcome of the Oslo Accords. Barack Obama did absolutely nothing to further the improvement of the situation. So Biden, incidentally, there's a great deal of information now about Biden's role in the Obama administration as the most ardent advocate for the stupidest, most harmful Israeli policies and the most blindly supportive American approaches to Israel. And he is surrounded by advisors, and he is surrounded by donors, and he is surrounded by party leaders, all of whom believe every myth spun in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So it's not going to be a garden. It's not going to be a rose garden. Should Biden be elected, we have 5 months to go. Trump is cratering in the polls. He's done a terrible job in everything he's touched, but he could still be reelected given the ridiculous constitution that the United States suffers under, written by slaveholding aristocrats to prevent democracy, and which has succeeded in several of the past presidential elections in preventing a majority from electing a president. That may happen again, as it happened in 2016 in the last election. But should Biden be elected, I don't think that we have any reason to be pleased. However, he will be the head of a party which is moving rapidly in a positive direction, and he will have to come to terms with that. A lot will depend on whether the 2018 elections in terms of the House and the Senate are repeated in 2020. If the Democrats do as well in the Senate as they did in the House in 2018, if they improve their position in the House, you might have more progressive Democrats who will force him to take a better position. But that will require a lot of struggle, a lot of effort. A Biden administration will be susceptible to influence from Europe. Europeans don't need to be afraid of the ogre in the White House as they are today. They don't need to cower in Brussels and Paris and London every time Trump bleats or tweets, and might actually talk to Biden and his people and say to him, we have interests which are harmed by this foolish policy of only paying attention to Israeli needs and desiderata and completely ignoring the Palestinians. But it will not be easy even if Biden is elected.
Thank you very much. I think that's an excellent response, and I heartily share that. The disappointment of the Obama era. Now we're going to move to some questions. We got a number of them for you. Let's kick off with Gillian Mosley. Gillian, are you with us?
Yes, sorry. This is pie in the sky, and thank you so much for a really interesting talk, and I can't wait to read your book. What in your mind is the optimal solution?
That's an easy question. I'm joking. The optimal solution, I try and lay out some of the parameters in the book. The optimal solution involves justice. I mean, there has to be an acceptance that there are now two peoples. That is going to be extremely hard for the Israelis, but it'll also be hard for the Palestinians to accept that a colonial settler project has produced a nation state and a people who have developed rights, not just individual rights, but also collective rights in Palestine. But that is absolutely essential. That solution has to not just give everybody the same political rights on an individual level or civil rights or religious rights, so that if it's a Jewish site, the Jewish rights don't trump the Muslim or the Christian rights, but or civil rights such that Palestinian ownership is ignored and claims of Jewish ownership are imposed, but national rights. And that's not going to be easy to square in a very small country like that, whether it involves another partition or whether it involves a unitary or a federal or a cantonal state. I don't know. But there has to be an acceptance that both peoples have equal rights, that there's not, as the Jewish nation-state law, the nation-state law of the Jewish people passed in July 2018, said there is one people with the right of national self-determination in the land of Israel. That is a declaration, another, in effect, declaration of war on the Palestinians, is to say, you don't exist as a people. Only we exist as a people in the entirety of this land. That whole approach has to change. And that is not going to be easy. But what the solution entails in terms of the details, I'm completely agnostic. I don't really care. One state, two states, many states. It doesn't really matter. As long as that principle of justice and equity is established. Someone whose relatives in Brooklyn can become a citizen immediately does not have rights and privileges over my family or other families who have lived in Palestine for centuries, God knows how long. That's the kind of systematic, legalized iniquity that has to be abolished. How you achieve national self-determination for what have developed into two distinct peoples in one country is obviously not easy. But that's my response to that question.
Thank you very much. And Mohammed Amin has got a question for you. Mohammed?
Yes, my question, putting ethics to one side, settler colonialism does succeed permanently in some places like the USA and Australia, either by totally exterminating the natives or, as in both of those countries where there are still Native Americans and Aborigines, by massively swamping them with incoming numbers. Now, absent either of those in Palestine, what do you actually predict happening?
Well, I often, in answer to that kind of a question about the future, my standard response is that the job description of a historian doesn't include predicting the future. I don't know. The answer is. What I will say is this. That there are a number of historical examples, of which you've cited two of the most important, of settler colonialism. Algeria is another, South Africa is another, the two Rhodesias are others. Kenya,
those were failed examples. Those were failed examples because they didn't exterminate and they didn't swamp.
I understand that. New Zealand, Canada, the United States, and Australia are the kinds of examples that you're referring to. In all of those cases, you had a process whereby the settlers, as you suggest, overwhelmed the indigenous population. That has not happened in Palestine. Nor is the indigenous population overwhelmingly a majority, as was the case in Algeria and the cases in Africa, where settler colonialism was completely reversed. So we're somewhere in between. In some ways, we're closer to the Irish model, if you want. It's impossible to say how this will develop. There is an Arab majority, in spite of systematic waves of ethnic cleansing going back to 1948, notably the Nakba of 1948 during the first war of 1948, first against the Palestinians and then against the Arab armies. The majority of the Arab population were expelled from their homes or forced to flee or fled in terror. There were further waves of similar ethnic cleansing after 1967. At least 100, maybe close to 200,000 people were forced to leave. In spite of that, you have an Arab majority today between the river and the sea. So it is a settler colonial case where the settler colonial entity, the new state, has established control over the entirety of the territory, where it has managed to box the indigenous population, in many cases, as in Gaza or in much of the West Bank, into tiny enclaves while taking most of the rest of the country for itself, but has not succeeded in the kind of demographic transformation that took place in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, and New Zealand. So how it will play out, I don't know. But it is a unique, it's one of the problems with these facile comparisons to either the United States or Algeria or South Africa. Yes, there are parallels between all cases of settler colonialism, but each one is completely different.
Now we have a question from Maggie Foyer. Maggie.
The cooperation that's in place at the moment between the PA and Israel on economics and security, this is at the moment threatened. The PA are promising, saying they pull out. What will be the immediate consequences? The economy is already so fragile. What will happen?
Again, I don't know what will happen. A lot depends on how the Netanyahu government and the Trump regime, I'm going to start calling it that from now on, decide to play this. Because unfortunately, so far, Palestinian response has been entirely reactive. Instead of being proactive, instead of putting forward a project, instead of stating what they want as an outcome, this aged, politically bankrupt Palestinian leadership feebly reacts to initiatives by either Israel or the United States. So a lot will depend, unfortunately, on what the Americans and the Netanyahu government decide they're going to do. Should they carry out wholesale annexation, the PA has promised essentially to self-dissolve. And that will lead to a situation of greater or lesser measure of chaos and great economic distress among Palestinians who, as you say, are already distressed. What that will lead to, I can't say.
And in a similar vein, we have a question from Sir Vincent Feen, who used to be the UK Consul General in Jerusalem. Vincent?
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Rashid, for a very illuminating talk. I will read your book.
Hope so.
My question, books, indeed. I need more time. My question is one that I think you've addressed in part when you talked about reuniting the Palestinian body politic and making a proposal rather than being defensive. But my question is, and it's a bit difficult to answer, but if you were the leader of the national leadership now, in this situation, right now, what would you do? Would you abolish the PA? The reason I ask is that the PLO has been on a long journey from, I don't know, from Palestine into Jordan, to Beirut, to Tunis, to Gaza, to Ramallah. It's on Palestinian soil. Should it self-destruct?
I would do the following. I would resuscitate the Palestine Liberation Organization. There is an entirely false Palestinian narrative, which is that the Palestinian Authority, the Palestine National Authority, as they self-describe, is a state-building process. No, it is not a state-building process. It is a process to create elements of self-government for the Palestinian population under Israeli rule. That's what it was intended by the people who drafted the Oslo Accords, which is to say the Israelis. And it was the ceiling that was always intended from the moment Begin, Sadat, and Carter signed the Camp David Accords back in 1978 and the peace treaty in 1979. So no, I would say we have yet to achieve this project of liberation. And so the PLO would have to be resuscitated, in my view, outside of Palestine. I would keep, obviously, the elements of self-government that have been achieved inside Palestine to the extent that that's possible. But I would certainly say that neither the Oslo framework nor any negotiating framework that has been offered so far is acceptable. The Palestinians will negotiate on this basis. You mentioned the elements of international law that you would agree to negotiate on the basis of with these mediators. And the United States, of course, necessarily and inevitably, because of its power, has to be at the table. It would be at the table on the side of Israel. So the problem is the United States and Israel, the Palestinians and whoever chooses to be on their side, with a neutral mediator in between, would negotiate with the great power that has made everything possible and the Israeli state on a basis that would be entirely different than what has been accepted so far. The Security Council resolution doesn't refer to, Security Council resolution 242 does not refer to Palestine. It refers to states and land for peace, as you know, I'm sure better than I. I mean, I was in the Security Council chamber when some of these things were debated as a young man. My father worked for the Secretariat, so I followed some of the process, but anyone like yourself, a professional diplomat, has followed the ins and outs more closely than I have. It has nothing to do with Palestine. It was never intended to deal with the Palestine issue. So you need other bases in international law for a just resolution of the conflict. And obviously, as you said, you need a unified Palestinian national movement with clear strategic objectives, neither of which we unfortunately have at the moment.
Sorry, there was a question also from Magan Singodia, basically very quickly, is would Palestine declaring independence make a difference? What would happen?
Well, they've done it several times already. I'm not sure that repetition would have any effect. In 1988, there was a Declaration of Independence, and there was another one more recently. And as we say in the United States, that and 5 cents won't get you a cup of coffee. I mean, it's not a bad thing in and of itself. If those states that have supposedly recognized the state of Palestine would then take further steps, like taking Israel to the ICC or voting for sanctions every time Israel violates the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the state of Palestine, it would be it would be something meaningful. But that, of course, has not happened.
Mm. Well, now we're going to move a little bit to some of the external actors, and we got a question from Hadid Khosa. I hope I pronounced your name right. Hadid, are you with us?
He's muted.
Muted.
Yes, yes, Professor. My question is, can Britain play any role in this after the Israel they are saying that they're going to annex the West Bank and the rest of the Palestine? So can Britain play any role in this now?
Yes, absolutely. This is actually a potential tipping point, or could be, if Europeans, and Britain in particular, can take their courage in their hands, choose to defy the most reviled administration in American history, choose to defy a superpower which probably is at the lowest point since World War II in terms of its power and prestige, and actually stand up for British interests and say British interests will be measurably harmed if Britain does not stop or do everything possible in terms of sanctions and other decisive actions, the process which annexation is only a part of. In fact, you have to unreel things that have been done since 1967 and even before. And stopping annexation would be a first step in that direction. And by stopping annexation, I mean saying we will not only not recognize annexation, but we will start to treat the occupied territories as areas which are subject to sanctions. And we will start to sanction the Israeli state for taking measures like this. Kick them out of Eurovision. Kick them out of European soccer. I mean, there are so many things that can be done that really would affect Israeli public opinion in a way that might even change governments over time in Israel. Every time an American administration over the past 30 or 40 years has taken a minor step to sanction or withhold airplanes from Israel, to hold up loan guarantees, Israeli politics was moved as if by an earthquake. Serious sanctions by Europe, or even ignore Europe. There's a fifth column inside of Europe of the Eastern European fifth column of Israel. Countries like Hungary and Austria that won't allow any sanctions. Forget the EU. Britain's leaving it anyway. 6 European countries, 6 major European countries choosing to take sanctions together simultaneously outside the EU if necessary. That in and of itself would have an enormous impact, and Britain could be a leader in this. And I don't think it would be that hard to get the French or the Spanish or several other European, the Irish for certainly, or several other European governments on board. That in and of itself would be sufficient. And I would ignore the EU. If you can't get unanimity, hell with it. Britain's out of it anyway.
I have a controversial view, as I think that the Israelis should be welcome to the Eurovision Song Contest.
I mean, I have nothing against the Eurovision Song Contest, but it's an example of ways in which Israel has been made to feel welcome in a situation where it has been oppressing the Palestinians systematically for all of these generations. You cannot have those two things.
I mean, in a similar vein, is there anything else that Europe can do, that Miriam was asking, the European Union?
Well, Europe's relationship to Israel is primarily economic, but it's also a matter of making the Israelis feel comfortable. So the major measures that should be taken would be economic, in my view. But there are other things that are symbolic that I think would be, and also diplomatic, that would be of enormous importance. European countries agreeing with other permanent members of the Security Council to push forward a resolution that the United States would veto to put negotiations on an entirely new basis, for example. To say American brokership of this process has failed. A peace process? Egypt, yes. Jordan, yes. Where is the peace in Palestine that supposedly is being overseen by the United States? There's no peace in Palestine. The United States has systematically taken Israel's side, and we're still in a situation of conflict. So the United States has failed, and for Europe to say that would not be a bad thing. Everybody else in the world would agree. Only the Americans and a few tiny Micronesian islands would dispute that.
absolutely. And certainly Europe has
Nothing
many
against
tools.
Micronesia, I'm just saying.
Indeed, or Palau or whatever. But the EU also has the Horizon research project that it could actually force the Israelis out of. I think that would affect them. But we've got a question from Omar Badr. Omar, I can see you're there.
Hello. Hi, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed your book very much. So you spoke a bit about the role of Arab governments and Arab people. So I have a twofold question. I'll leave the second part till later if there's more time. But my first question is a bit detailed, and it's about a recent kind of update where the Saudi government is trying to, I don't know if you heard of, joining management of the Awqaf, the religious lands and property in Jerusalem. Yes. And they were trying to poke the Jordanian king. So my question is, how relevant is this update? What are the goals behind the move? What are potential consequences? And what does it speak to the kind of like the expanding relations between, I would say, the Saudi monarchy, not Saudi Arabia, and the Netanyahu government? Thank you.
Yeah, it's of course not surprising that Israel should prefer a distant autocracy with absolutely no popular input into its policies to be involved in Jerusalem, instead of a monarchy which has some semblance of a democracy and where there is public opinion, where there is a press, controlled press, but a press nevertheless, a parliament, gerrymandered parliament, but a parliament nevertheless. Jordan is subject to public opinion, not just Palestinian public opinion. East Bank Jordanian public opinion is strongly opposed to Jordan's peace treaty with Israel, is strongly opposed to many things that Jordan does, and is one of the reasons that Jordan has sometimes taken positive positions in Jerusalem in particular, whereby the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, Jordan has prerogatives and rights. Israel wants to erode those prerogatives and rights and wants to replace a government that is somewhat responsive to public opinion with a government that's complete, that tramples all over its public opinion. In the case of Saudi Arabia. So I think it's actually quite significant. It would involve a violation of the peace treaty. On the other hand, Jordan is a country that's very dependent on external support. And the United States and the Saudis and their Gulf allies putting pressure on Jordan puts them in a very, very difficult position as far as this issue is concerned.
Sorry, and could I invite Juliana Farha if you could ask your question on annexation?
Yeah. So my question, you've alluded to the issue in a number of your other answers, but I'm just curious about this annexation issue. It's hard for me to know what to make of it, because from what I hear from many people who go there, there is a de facto annexation anyway. And there's also, I'm aware of, and I have no sense of how strong it is, a kind of one single state movement. And I recall that when I heard the guy who runs the Adala Legal Center spoke at the Edward Said lecture here in London, I think it was last year or the year before, was talking about this.
Hassan Jabbareen?
He's a very jolly guy with a beard and mustache.
Hassan Jabbareen.
Okay. So he was talking about, he was talking about the focus on statehood rather than a focus on rights. And I guess my question to you then is, if there is a de facto annexation, what do you think a real annexation would make different? Is the fear that it would be an actual Nakba where people are displaced and physically removed? I mean, we've seen an increase in the number of Palestinian homes being demolished. So is that the fear, or is, I'm a little bit skeptical of people's obsession with the two-state solution at this point. It seems like a bit of a kind of liberal cloak to sort of hide themselves in, because it doesn't challenge what's going on there at the moment. So yeah, I'm just curious about your view about this.
Right.
And before you answer that one on the two states, because we've got Jonathan Rosenhead wanted to ask something on the one state. Jonathan?
Yes, I was listening to a webinar that Noam Chomsky gave yesterday to the Jerusalem bookshop, Imad bookshop, and he was emphatic as always that that one-state solution was a non-starter because Israel would never accept it, and therefore, without any acceptance from Israel, it would never happen. I just wondered what your view was on that.
If we are going to depend on what Israelis will voluntarily accept, the only solution will be complete dissolution of Palestine and its absorption into the greater land of Israel. That's the direction we're going. So the idea that a two-state solution is somehow acceptable to the forces that are increasingly dominating Israeli politics is, I think, at the very least questionable. I'm no opponent of the two-state solution in principle, but two-state solution would require a partition, which would require undoing everything that Israel has systematically done since 1967. Over 53 years, Israel has created realities intended to prevent Palestinian self-determination. The whole point of Zionism is that there is only one people in the land of Israel with rights, national rights. And that is not a labor position or a Likud position. That is the Zionist position. And that's the position that most Israelis today fervently accept. So when they talk about a two-state solution, when Rabin talked about a two-state solution, he said a state minus, no sovereignty, security control, we keep the Jordan River. That's not a two-state solution. That's a one-state solution. The state of Israel and dependent, you can call them Bantustans, you can call them reservations, you can call them whatever you choose to call them. They are not a state. And that is not on offer from the Israeli majority. So that majority has to change. There has to be some compulsion or some conversion on the road to Damascus or some other change, fundamental change in Israeli attitudes before you're going to have any solution, 1, 2, 3, or 5. So that's the first point. The second point is to speak to what Juliana said. Yes, there has been creeping annexation over 53 years. Israeli law already applies to all Israeli colonists in the occupied territories. In effect, Israel has annexed any place that an Israeli stands on. Palestinian law doesn't apply to them. Israeli law applies to them. And Israeli funding and Israel has extended itself into over 60% of the occupied territories. It controls it and is the effective sovereign, even though it hasn't formally annexed. So this would be a step, but it would be a step which would, I think, I've argued it would be a major nail in the coffin of the two-state solution, and is intended as such by its proponents. The fervent opposition to Palestinian self-determination runs across most of the Israeli political spectrum, but the people who are working the hardest are the ones on the farthest right of that spectrum. And that's what they intend annexation to do, to make it absolutely impossible to have a two-state solution. That's part of their obsession. And that's, I think, one reason that annexation should be fought by anybody who claims to be in favor either of a two-state solution or of justice and equity, or of a one-state solution. I mean, it is a bad thing in and of itself, irrespective of what you want. And I think this debate about how many states can dance on the head of a pin distracts us from more important things, like what the state of Israel and the settlers are doing day in, day out. There has to be some effective means of opposing that, not just by the Palestinians, but by others in the world.
Thank you for that. Now we have a question going back to US politics from Ahlam Akram. Ahlam, are you there? Maybe she's not anymore, but
I'm here.
Yeah, hi.
I'm here.
I see her.
In the past few days, I have attended a couple of meetings by Israelis themselves about different solutions. And I must admit there was one which was ideal, a land for the two people, but unfortunately, politically, it's too late. And that's an ideal situation maybe in the future. But my main concern politically, I think, okay, I'm going to keep on calling for two-state solution for the two-state solution. But at the same time, I think we have to keep in mind that definitely Israel is going ahead with the annexation, and we should be prepared for that. What you have said, basically, justice and equality. One state for all its people, you know, under those banners. But my main question concerning American politics, do you think that Bernie Sanders in any way could be an influence, a positive influence in Biden if he wins the election? Do you believe, because there is a shift in public opinion,
Right.
you know, and I believe that shift should be encouraged basically by Jews themselves. I hope so. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sanders has personally, and together with the movement that he's helped to create, has measurably advanced the discourse in the United States. He, the Congressional Black Caucus, a group of progressives in the House of Representatives, and a few other politicians, including actually Elizabeth Warren, have opened up the space for what can be said. I have to say, the enormities perpetrated by Israel have helped to open up that space. And that space has been opened up not just at the base of the Democratic Party, where you have, look at the numbers, the polling, they're more favorable to Palestine than they are to Israel, the base of the Democratic Party. That shift has encompassed not just young people, college campuses, but a large part of the American Jewish community, where there's a raging debate over Israel's actions. You had recently a petition by leading figures in the British Jewish community opposing annexation. I'm sure all of you are aware of it. There are similar moves, less public, by the liberal Zionist establishment in the United States, expressing shock and horror at the annexation proposal to the Israeli leadership, because it reveals that the emperor has no clothes. It reveals that talk of a two-state solution, talk of a Palestinian state, is just that. It's talk designed to cloak the increasing one-state reality that Israel has been imposing ever since the Zionist project began. Herzl wasn't talking about two states. Jabotinsky wasn't talking about two states. Ben Gurion wasn't talking about two states. None of them intended or
Lost you.
or wished for a Palestinian state. In fact, their whole extensive doing, and that's the project. It's delusional to believe otherwise. So I think that as far as the shift is concerned, to answer your question more directly, Sanders has had an impact. I am skeptical about the impact that he can have going forward, simply because a lot will depend on how Biden stacks his cabinet, who he puts in his National Security Council, who he puts, assuming he's elected, obviously, whom he makes Secretary of State, National Security Advisor. It's probably going to be somebody like Tony Blinken, who is as blinkered and blinded a supporter of Israel as anyone in the American political spectrum. He probably will be National Security Advisor. He's been the closest person to Biden on foreign policy for more than a decade and a half. And Sanders and others in the Senate and the House can have an impact. A lot will depend on who's vice president. I mean, we've learned that Biden played a very destructive role as vice president in terms of sabotaging things that the Obama administration was trying to do. Somebody like Warren, or it will be a woman most likely, or possibly another a progressive Democratic woman, could have an impact. As could Sanders, but I think that he peaked once he failed to win the nomination, as far as his own personal influence was concerned.
Thank you.
Very much. I think we're now going to have to bring this to a close. We've gone well over the hour and taken up a lot of Professor Rashid's valuable time. We've heard a fantastic and insightful exposition of the last 100 years and some thoughts about the future. Thank you, everyone, to all of your questions, because they were great. I'm sorry I couldn't get everybody in, but I think we managed to cover a huge amount of ground and hopefully managed to answer most of them. Just to say also that if you enjoy these seminars, etc., please do join Caabu if you wouldn't mind as a member, or a donation to help us to keep going. We will obviously be having more coming up. Watch out for the emails that are coming out. So finally, Rashid, thank you so much. That was just absolutely terrific, and we're really grateful for the time you've taken today. My video is somewhat wonky at the moment, my internet connection, forgive me. but it was wonderful to hear from you. And please, finally, everybody, read the book. It's a terrific work.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to Caabu. When I was a graduate student in the UK in the early 70s, I remember Caabu had just been founded a few years earlier. And I'm happy to see that you're still in business and doing good work. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Thank you, everyone.